July the 8th, 1977. I had to look up the date, but having done so, the memories just came flooding back. It was a Friday, and on that day, as a 9-year-old boy, I watched something on television that's not only stayed with me ever since, but has also helped to shape the rest of my life. It was a cover drive by England all-rounder and former captain Tony Greig, playing in a test match against Australia at Old Trafford. It was a shot much employed by Greig throughout his career, and his method was always the same. From his upright stance, as soon as he saw a ball pitched up, he would thrust his left leg down the pitch and, with perhaps a little bit more bottom hand than the purists would like, threw his whole weight at the approaching ball. On the occasion that still lives in my mind's eye now, he made perfect contact with the delivery from Max Walker, and it flew to the cover boundary like a rocket. Even now, I remember my reaction. "Wow," I said to myself out loud. And it was at that moment, whether consciously or not, I said to myself, "Cricket, that'll do for me." Of course, as a youngster, I had other cricketing heroes besides Tony Greig. There was Derek Randall, fresh from his brilliant 174, complete with hook shots against the mighty Dennis Lee, and Ian Botham, who, within a year, would take over Greig's mantle as England's premier all-rounder. But that day, back in July 1977, still burns bright in my mind, as if it was yesterday. In the 35 years that have gone since that day, I've followed the game religiously, and for the past 22 of those years, I've made my living from it, now as a journalist and a broadcaster, but also for a decade as an administrator. As for Greig, he's made his living covering the game too, having done so for more than 30 years since retiring as a player, a retirement hastened by the fallout from World Series cricket, a project he backed from the outset and which has helped shape the modern game we love today. That was a battle in itself, as Kerry Packer fought and won against the game's then conservative establishment, a fight based initially on the issue of television rights in Australia. Greig was by Packer's side throughout a lengthy court case played out in London, and it was an association that cost him the England captaincy, but Greig's behaviour in taking on the powers that be could never be considered a surprise, given he's never been one to shy away from a contest. And now he faces the biggest contest of all, a battle to overcome lung cancer. As a player, the willingness to battle, to stand toe-to-toe with the opposition, typified the man. He always seemed to bristle, invariably chewing gum, and with his collar upturned. When he batted, there was no crouching in his stance. Instead, he stood upright with bat raised, a legacy of his enormous 6 feet 6 inch frame that meant crouching was actually a significant discomfort. His demeanour and his mannerisms made him the archetypal red rag to the bowling bulls of that era, whether it was in signalling fours against Lillee and Jeff Thompson in their prime, or through his now infamous remark about making the West Indies grovel ahead of their 1976 series. That comment, coming from a white South African-born player about a team of black men in an era of apartheid, could not have been more ill-judged. But despite it making him public enemy number one in the eyes of Clive Lloyd's massed ranks of pace bowlers, his response was typical, with a belligerent double of 116 and 76 not out in a roller-coaster Leeds test. And then, when his side had been battered into submission at the Oval in the following match, which featured 14 wickets from Michael Holding and 291 from Vivian Richards, he had the humility and the humour to grovel himself, crawling back to the pavilion on his hands and knees in mock surrender. Humour certainly played its part in Greig's on-field persona, despite his reputation as a no-holds-barred competitor. Patrick Eager's photograph from England's 1976-77 tour of India illustrates that point, with the big man playing dead, lying flat on his back in front of 100,000 fans at Calcutta's Eden Gardens, his reaction to a firecracker going off just as the bowler reached delivery stride. Once the joke was over, though, Greig picked himself up to score his 8th and final Test 100, a captain's innings of 103, and one which played a crucial part in helping to secure his side's series-winning 3-1 success against an Indian side with spinners Bishan Singh Bedi, Bhagwat Chandrasekhar and Erapali Prasanna in their prime. And for anyone who doubts, can't remember, or simply doesn't know how good a player Greig was, one look at his figures should be enough to answer that question. In 58 tests, and he never missed one from his first to his last over 6 years, he scored 3,599 runs at 40.43, including those 800s, and took 141 wickets at 32.2 each. He could bowl seam-up medium pace, off-spin or off-cutters, and it was in the latter style that he took 13 wickets in a test against a West Indies side including Gary Sobers in 1974. And he managed 87 catches too, mostly as a brilliant slip fielder. His one-handed diving effort to remove Rodney Marsh in the summer of 1977 was for a long time part of the BBC's opening sequence for its coverage. He was also a fearless close-in fielder in the days before shin guards and helmets. His figures as an international all-rounder really do stack up alongside the very best. As for those who know him simply for his accent, his catchphrases, or his occasional gaffes at the microphone, it's also worth remembering what a passionate lover of the game he has been and remains, something typified by his MCC Cowdrey lecture at Lord's. Greig has been part of the fabric of Australia's summer game and of cricket around the world for longer than most of us care to mention, but 2012 marks 40 years since his Test debut. He's never been everyone's cup of tea. Just ask those establishment figures of the 1970s, many of whom never forgave him for what they felt was his initially secret siding with Packer ahead of the England captaincy, a part of what they saw as rampant commercialism and opportunism. Indeed, it's impossible to reflect on Greig's achievements without recognising the controversies, not just the Packer issue or that grovel remark, but also his running out of the West Indies batsman Alvin Kalicharan in Port of Spain in 1974 after the final ball of the day had been bowled but before over had been called, although Kalicharan was later reinstated when the England captain Mike Donness and team manager Donald Carr agreed the appeal should be withdrawn. Bloody-minded, at times almost certainly, selfish perhaps, but passionate about cricket and life without question. And my preference will always be to think of the positives Greig brought to English cricket at a time when much of the game in the country had a distinctly grey and staid feel to it. For this now middle-aged man, the thought of Tony Greig brandishing his St. Peter bat, a brand long since disappeared, white mitten-style gloves on his hands, thrusting his big left leg down the pitch to essay another cover drive, is still enough to bring a smile to my face. Tony's always loved a battle. Let's hope this latest one is another he'll win.